Hello, I'm Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers. We hope you are enjoying this year's Secular Student Alliance Conference. In case you aren't already familiar with us, Black Nonbelievers is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Headquartered in the Atlanta area, we connect with other Blacks and allies who are living free of religion by providing a caring, friendly, and informative environment. Instead of accepting dogma, we determine truth and morality through reason and evidence. The mission of Black Nonbelievers is to provide secular fellowship, nurture and support nonbelievers in coming out, i.e. open identification, to promote pride in the atheist and secular identities, and to organize members for a variety of events and charitable causes. Black Nonbelievers welcomes all, regardless of age, gender identity, sexual identity, national origin, and racial identity. 2021 marks 10 years of Black Nonbelievers building community, increasing the representation of the Black atheist demographic, and advocating for true liberation. And we need you to help us continue and expand on our work. Please do follow us and subscribe on social media. On Facebook at Black Nonbelievers, Instagram at Be Nonbelievers Inc., Twitter at Be Nonbelievers, and YouTube at Black Nonbelievers Inc. Also, please do visit our website at blacknonbelievers.org to find out the many ways that you can contribute and support our organization financially. Finally, we hope that you will join us for our upcoming events, including the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference, which can now be streamed online, and we have student discounts available, and BNCCon in November. Thank you very much, and continue to enjoy the conference.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you joining us this morning. My name is Kevin Bowling. I'm the Executive Director of the Secular Student Alliance, and I'm very pleased to have Debbie and Alison with us here today. A couple little housekeeping items. Debbie and Alison will have their presentation, and then we will have a Q&A that follows that. So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A tab. For those of you on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, please feel free to type your questions that you may have in the comments. We do have staff who are monitoring those comments, and they will send those to me so we can get those answered for you today. So without further ado, let me go ahead. So Alison and Debbie are here talking about data and diversity, expanding our understanding of the secular community. Alison is manages American Atheist federal and state advocacy for religious equality and litigation activities to protect the separation from the state. And if you've seen Alison on her meeting, she's absolutely fantastic. And Debbie's the vice president of programs at American Atheist. She has been involved in the secular movement since a college student. We love that. She's also engaged in LGBT activism and civil rights work. So please, Alison and Debbie, it's great to have you joining us here today, and I'm excited to see your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to present here. It's great to be part of the SSA conference. I'm personally sorry that I wasn't able to attend yesterday. I had other meetings on my schedule, and I'm looking forward to seeing the videos from those later. So hello, everyone on the internet. Thanks for having us here. I'll give a very brief introduction and a quick overview of the structure. We want to make sure that we leave a good amount of time at the end for any questions on this topic. So we'll start with, sorry, what?
I'll share my screen so you can see the agenda.
Oh, cool.
There we go.
We'll start with some brief background, a little bit of an introduction. Then Alison will talk about American Atheist Data Project and how it relates to our advocacy work. Then I'll come back on to focus a little more on how we can be informed by some of those results to foster a better secular community. We should have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end, though that's flexible. to have questions. So make sure that you send those in as you go if you like, or save them to the end, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So on this topic, I was thinking as I was working on a sneeze is coming. Inconveniently timed. Nope, it's not there. I was thinking about something that happened relatively recently and how it related to this. And I saw some other things on the schedule from Thursday and Friday, about intersectionality and organizing and building a strong community group. So about, 6 weeks ago, I filled out a survey done by research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She was looking to interview atheist women about the kinds of issues that affect them as women and atheists. And she was actually somewhat inspired by the survey project that Alison will be talking about. We saw something pop up. I was like, I'm gonna fill this out. And at the end it asked if you wanted to potentially do an interview with them. So I was like, yeah, I'll do an interview, sure. So I did that almost a month ago to the date. And I realized during the questions I was asked that it was very hard to separate out exactly when something happened that felt like discrimination or marginalization or stigmatization that only had to do with atheism, or only had to do with being a person of color, or only had to do with being perceived as female and a woman, or perhaps, I was pegged as being very queer and dressing like a lesbian or whatever. It was very hard with some of the questions that I was asked, like, were you ever treated such and so way because you're an atheist, a woman? I was like, well, without race being a factor, because that's a lot harder to answer. And it's interesting to think about the fact that we have not had good data about atheists basically forever. When I got involved in this community as a college student 21 years ago, in 2000, the same year that the SSA started, there was basically almost nothing. They were just starting to pull out atheists as a group, or to find atheists in the different post-census surveys and research projects that were being done, but there weren't a lot of us, and there was just not enough information on them. So it's been interesting to see the developments over the past 20 years, but still the massive shortfalls in information that we have about what atheists experience, atheists and non-religious people, what we care about, and then to do something with that information and to let people know about it. So I'm really excited when I joined American Atheists about 3 years ago to be working with Alison Gill and some other awesome people on the team, and that we've been able to do this massive groundbreaking project and collect some really interesting data, a lot of it that we have been slicing and dicing in different ways to pull out results in different kinds of ways. But I'll let Alison talk about that. So I'll turn that over to you, Alison.
Great, thank you so much, Debbie. So I'll start by talking about the need for the data. So as Debbie was saying, there's not a lot of data collection about non-religious people, and that's not just non-religious people, it's all different types of religious groups. They just don't ask about religious beliefs on federal surveys. So that's really important because federal surveys are the primary way that we know about various different issues that affect Americans. Like, for example, there's national health surveys, surveys about education and youth, surveys about the workplace. And without that surveys that sort of can break it down, then we just don't know different facts about our population that are really important for us to know so we can see where the disparities are. And in fact, on religion, there was a law passed in 1978 that prohibits the census from asking any data about religion, to ask any questions about religion. And although it's not prohibited in other types of surveys, it's often just sort of, downstream from the census. So because they don't use it as census, there's no tested questions, and there's very, very, very few federal surveys that ask anything about religion. So there's just this dearth of data. There has been a few really good population surveys by great organizations like PRRI and the Pew Research Center, but those are focused on the population more broadly and different subsections of the population. For example, Catholic people or religiously unaffiliated people. And so usually I go into some detail to talk about that, but they ask about religiously unaffiliated people, but that's not the same thing as being atheist or non-religious. If you look at the data that they have around unaffiliated people, the majority of them actually are religious in some ways. They might be maybe New Age beliefs, or they might be spiritual, or they might believe in the existence of a God, or say that religion is very important to them in their lives. And so, frankly, we wouldn't consider those people really atheists or non-religious people. So given that, we really felt the need to do a community survey to dive deeper into this population and find out more about ourselves for a variety of reasons. Why is this important? Well, because this data, without this type of data, non-religious people and the issues that we face are invisible. If we can't talk about disparities where they exist, if we can't talk about issues people are facing in their lives, then for many purposes, they just don't exist to lawmakers, to advocates, to others. And all we're left with is sort of anecdotes. And, as atheists and non-religious people tend to care a lot about science, so a lot of you might understand that anecdotes don't make data. Just because we believe something is true, or our friend encounters it or something, it does not mean that it's a widespread issue, or maybe we can't see some widespread issues. I'm not going to talk about this here, but actually our research really did find that, like in the majority, well, not the majority, in many places in the country, there's very different experiences between people that live, for example, in more liberal areas like DC, where I live, or New Jersey, where American Atheist is based, versus, for example, Mississippi or Utah, which are much different and more religiously oppressive for non-religious people. So data is really essential for us to understand our community needs, for us to engage in advocacy, to make sure services that exist that both we provide and that the larger society provides are tailored to fit the needs of non-religious people appropriately. And it allows the community and people performing programs to seek funding from foundations and the government. So today we're going to be talking mostly about understanding community needs. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into that area. First, I'll tell you a bit more about the survey. We conducted the survey at the end of 2019. It was a community survey online. Community survey means that people take it, they tell their friends, who tell their friends, and there's sort of a widening expanse of people that are taking it. And we had an amazing amount of interest in this survey. We had nearly 34,000 people take the survey. About 10% of them were ages 18 to 24, which we considered youth participants. And I will talk about that more in a moment. Our original goal was 5 to 10K, and we actually blew past that in the first 8 hours of the survey, which is amazing. Which shows, both how important this is to non-religious people and how much they wanted to sort of express their voices and be heard, which I think goes to show that there is a lack of this sort of data collection, and we really need more of it. So the report itself is available at www.secularsurvey.org. And you can see here is the fantastic cover. So at secularsurvey.org. And we also, partnering with Secular Student Alliance, did a report focusing on that subpopulation of 18 to 24-year-olds called the tipping point generation. So it's about 3,400 respondents, which is also a huge number for a survey like this. And so that is a lot of really amazing, interesting data. It's also available at secularsurvey.org. And I should mention that we're in the process of creating and putting out additional subpopulation briefs. For example, the next two will be on Black non-religious Americans and also non-religious women. So that will be coming out soon. So, there's a lot of great things I'm talking about the survey. I've been talking about the positive side. There were some, I don't want to say failings, but some things that could be improved about it as well. And one of the things that I've got to highlight here is about demographics. Now, there are many areas where we had terrific range with great representation. For example, we had a really good age range distribution. I mentioned about 10% were ages 18 to 24, but the age ranges across the board were very diverse, which is terrific. It gives us a good picture of what the community looks like. We also had a good distribution across the country with enough people in every state to do a solid assessment of that state, even states with lower populations. We also had terrific LGBTQ representation. with, I think, about 25% of the sample identifying as LGBTQ in one way or another. However, we'd had terrible in terms of race and sex representation, as you can see some of the data here. And that's for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into in a minute. But, compared to the broader population, the number of respondents that were African-American or Black was about 1/5 what the broader, if you look at the US population, so it was 2.7%, which is, about a fifth of 13%. And for Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish people, it was about 1/3 of the broader population. And if you, let's see, interestingly though, if you look at biracial or multiracial, we had about twice the population in this country. So that was higher. And for white participants, it was about 16 points or 16% higher than the general population. So that's clearly overrepresented, and you can see the difference in sex as well. It's about 60% male and about 40% female identified. So you can see the differences there. Now, this is I mentioned a convenience sample, which means it is not representative of the full population of non-religious people. It's just representative of the people that took the survey. So this does not necessarily reflect our community more broadly or what it looks like. These factors might have to do with the types of outreach that we did. Maybe we were not reaching certain groups. Maybe certain groups have other impediments which keep them from taking an online survey. We did offer it in Spanish, but there are other impediments as well. And maybe, folks didn't realize it was in Spanish, or there was not enough Spanish language promotion, for example. And also there might be the fact that some of these groups are less represented in non-religious communities. We don't know that for sure. So I can't say that. And anyway, so that's sort of where that is. But it's one of the areas we were hoping to improve upon. But you can see there's definitely an overrepresentation by white men, if that's helpful to think about that. So one of the things we looked at is policy priorities. So we asked participants to identify their top 3 priority issues that they would like to see secular organizations work on. So we asked them both, what issues are most important to you generally, and what are the top 3 issues you want secular organizations to work on? And this is the latter chart. So these are the issues that participants felt that secular organizations should prioritize. And you can see the top 3 here. Maintaining secular public schools, that was number 1 across the board for every single group that we surveyed. The second, opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination. And the third was access to abortion and contraception. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. This varied quite a lot by different groups that we subpopulations that we looked at. I do want to note that, there's a stereotype about non-religious people and what we're seeking and what we're after, that, we care a whole bunch about, crosses on public land and that sort of thing, and religious displays. You can see that's at the bottom there with 13.3% saying that we should prioritize that issue. And that was actually on the bottom across every group. So I found that really interesting, that there's a stereotype that, that's all atheists care about, and it's actually lowest. So, of course there is a subsection that does want to prioritize that, but that gives you an idea. So I mentioned there's quite a difference among different subpopulations. Among young people, we saw quite a difference from the general population. Young people wanted to include protecting youth from religion-based harm. It's the second issue, so right after maintaining the secular public schools, it was protecting youth from religion-based harm, which is probably not surprising because it focused on youth, right? And number 3 was protecting the environment and addressing climate change. So I found this really interesting, and I think it helps demonstrate the importance of this data work because, prior to this, I had not really thought about the environment and climate change as an atheist issue as much. It's an important issue, but it's not necessarily an atheist issue. But this goes to show not only is it very important to a subset of the community, but it's one of the top issues that they would like secular organizations to work on. So not just they think it's important, but they think it's important for secular issues to prioritize. And that was especially true among young people ages 18 to 24. Among Black participants, it had the same top 3 as the general population, but we saw more support for the second 2 items, opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination and access to abortion and contraception. Interestingly, there was also a different prioritization for sort of the lower priority items. We saw a lot of focus on protecting youth from religion-based harm, for sex education, and for persecution, preventing persecution of non-religious people internationally. So there was a lot of higher level of support for those things as well. When it came to LGBTQ participants, there wasn't that many differences, but we did see that LGBTQ equality was at 41.7%, which put it at number 2, right after maintaining secular public education. And among women, we saw the same top 3 as the general population, but access to abortion was much higher than any other group, almost tied with secular public schools. So it almost overtook, it was the one group that almost overtook secular public schools as the most important item. We saw significantly less concern with typical church-state matters, such as inappropriate political activity by churches, public funding of religious schools, and religious displays on public property. So those issues were less important overall to the women participants. So I want to provide just some takeaways from this. What counts as a secular issue really does depend very much on who you ask, right? We saw some pretty significant deviations here, and some things that, like I mentioned, climate change, which some folks maybe not consider a secular issue, was really important to a subset of the community. We also have an overrepresentation, definitely in our sample, but possibly in our movement at large, right? We don't really know for sure, by white males, which definitely affects what issues are considered priorities. That affected very clearly, obviously, how, what issues were listed as priorities in our survey. And it might impact what we as a broader movement consider our priorities as well. So I think that's an important takeaway. Like, what we consider secular issues reflects who we are and who we're asking. And also, people care about issues that affect them directly and others like them, which probably is not like a major revelation, but it's important to understand. Like, the LGBT constituents, really cared about LGBT issues. Women constituents really cared about abortion and access to contraception, et cetera. And youth participants really cared about issues that allow discrimination and harm against youth, just to give you a few examples. So it really does matter if we really want to access other groups and reach them and think about what's important to them. It's important to think about things like this, because it helps us understand like how we should consider what issues are important and what we should be working on. I wanted to just take a second to talk about American atheists' policy priorities. So we usually break them down into 3 distinct sort of categories or subsets. First of all, we work to prevent discrimination, harassment, and coercion against atheists and non-believers. So we usually frame that as protecting the civil rights of atheists and non-religious people. We work to limit the harm that religion causes to third parties, especially children. And this is one of the ways that we especially get to areas that I've been talking about, such as conversion therapy, ending child marriage, sex education, faith healing. So these are issues that have, religion often promoted in the name of religion and have a disproportionate negative impact on certain populations, especially young people. And third, we oppose special privileges based on religious belief. And we also frame this a lot as protecting the separation of religion and government. And this includes things where religious exemptions cause harm, including discrimination based on LGBTQ status or race or disability, and also access to reproductive care. Those are 2 important issues where religious exemptions can really disrupt access to basic services and civil rights. I wanted to also take a second and talk about some of our coalition work, because one of the major ways we work on these diverse issues is through our broad coalitions and partnerships. So coalition work basically means, we're working closely with a coalition of other groups for a variety of different purposes. So it can be issue-based, right? It can be maybe we're working to address criminalization in prisons. Right? That's one example of a coalition that we might be on. It can be purposeful. Maybe we're working to pass a bill. So we're allied with other groups to sort of support that legislation. Or it could be identity related. We're working to address broad civil rights issues and focus on, different identity. Like, for example, we're in different coalitions based on LGBTQ rights, to give you an example. So here are some of the coalitions that we work at the national level. We have a lot of partnerships with other secular organizations. For example, we run a regular group called Secular State Strategies, where we focus on partnering with other national groups to focus on like things that are happening in state law, like state legislation that we can oppose or support that affect the separation of religion and government. We work with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is the primary coalition focused on civil rights. And we work on issues ranging from healthcare to education to policing and prisons. So that's a really important coalition. We work on reproductive issues and access. For example, there is the Title X Coalition, which focuses on access to family planning services, and also the Sex Ed Coalition, which makes sure that young people can have access to sex education across the country. The LGBTQ State Advocacy Coalition, maybe you folks know there's a huge wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation across the country, especially targeting trans youth. And through our work in this coalition, we can help to sort of oppose that work, those negative bills. And the FedWatch Coalition, which we work with other partners to advance policy change at the federal level in administration, through agencies like the Department of Education or Department of Justice. So these are just examples, but they show you how we work in different types of coalition. And we think this is a really important approach for a variety of reasons, not just for us, but we also recommend it to local groups and partners as well. So why is it? What are the benefits here? Well, it allows us to expand the issues we work on. Like American Atheists can't work on everything ourselves, but by partnering in coalition, we're able to sort of let others guide things and join with them to throw our voice behind their work and support them where needed. It also allows us to work on things where we might not have complete expertise. Like we're not experts in everything under the sun, right? So there's some issues like state-church separation and religious equality where we are experts, but we don't know necessarily everything about trans youth in schools, for example. So that might be something that another group needs to take leadership on, and we can support their work as needed. It allows us to engage with new partners. So there's lots of different groups out there that are issues that we might work on. It allows us to sort of expand our influence and learn about different groups and what they're doing so we can understand how to support their efforts. Also, we can see new and different ways where our work is impacted. One example is, for example, prison work, right? There's a lot of work around prison reform in this country, which is desperately needed. But some of the ways that opposition is trying to do is get into prisons to allow them to do sort of religious programming to a population that isn't really able to resist it. So that allows us to see that and learn more about it so we can figure out how we can best play a role in stopping this sort of targeting against the captive population. We can also, of course, by working together in a coalition, we bring sort of strength that otherwise we wouldn't have. Just us speaking out on the matter is not as strong as many different groups coming together with different perspectives be able to speak out against the matter. And it also, there's an increase in efficiency if we work together in coalition. We can pool our resources, share contacts, figure out who is best to do different tasks. Like sometimes, especially when you're doing advocacy, different lawmakers or policymakers or advocates, they need to hear from different groups. And sometimes, secular groups or atheist groups are not the best voice. Sometimes it's different types of groups that would be the best voice to sort of, meet the people where they're at and help them understand the issue. So by partnering, we're able to sort of figure out who would be the best to sort of approach lawmakers or lead, and we're able to take a step backwards where we need to and move forward where we need to. So there's a lot of benefits here. When thinking about coalition building, you should think about organizations with similar or aligned interests to you, and also some of the issues that your members care about. So it can be useful to speak with your members and think about like what issues are most important to them so that you can figure out who to partner with. There's also, you might have groups that sort of align with you frequently, maybe on reproductive issues or LGBTQ issues. And those can be important coalition partners that you might want to formalize something with, so you have regular meetings and can talk with them about how to align your interests and work together. Think about other organizations affected by relevant issues too. For example, if you did want to go further into the environment and climate change and working against it, it's advisable to speak with groups that make that their #1 priority, so that you understand and can sort of slot into their advocacy agenda and sort of figure out how to work together in a way that makes sense and is complementary. Consider your organizational capacity, like how many coalitions you really have time to be on, and which ones make most sense for you to prioritize, and which are most active. It's also helpful to think about, if you're doing lobbying work, for example, what coalitions or organizations can you partner with that have, for example, a lobbyist that would be able to help you. This is more important for maybe advocates at the state level, at the local level. But what groups can you join with that might expand capacity to do the work is a really good question to ask yourself. And sometimes coalitions are brought together by opposition. So, who is fighting against your rights or what you're looking for? Well, maybe you can make common cause with other groups that are also being opposed by those interests. So that can be another way to think about coalitions. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it back to Debbie, but I'd love to take questions later. So if you have any questions for what I've been talking about, please write them down and we will get back to it afterwards. And with that, Debbie, it's all you.
Cool. I heard you speak about this survey before, and yet I always learn something, a lot in fact, from your presentations on this. And it's a good reminder too, because we started that project in 2019, right? That's when you did the focus groups and things, yeah.
It is. I really started in 2018, like sort of building up for it. But yeah, 2019 is when
And there's more coming. So, community. For this, for the ideas I'm going to share, I was thinking about the likely audience that would be here and the people who would be tuning into this in the future. Unfortunately, I don't recognize a lot of the names of the attendees here. I assume that a good number of you are students and involved with student groups, whether in leadership positions or membership positions. So that's what this section will be mostly focused on, regarding what kind of community that many of you probably have access to and are part of, and what you can do in those communities. So we learned from the survey that being involved in a secular community group can have a beneficial effect on mental health. I'm sure many of you who've been involved in this community have stories of your own, or have heard stories from others about different benefits they've had from being involved in local groups and campus groups. And we also learned that from people that there are barriers to involvement in our secular community groups. So that raises an important question of how can we build more inclusive secular communities? And I think most of us who've been involved in this community for any length of time have thought about this in different ways, because the lack of diversity is pretty apparent if you've gone to some meetings. There have been a lot of discussions about how to increase diversity in our movement, how to make sure that we're welcoming to different kinds of people. When I first got involved when I was 20, basically every local group I joined was really excited to have me, because I was 1/3 of the average age. And for some of the humanist groups I show up to now, I'm still half of the average age of attendees. I was also a person of mysterious color and female. And so they were like, please be on our advisory board. And that's still a question we have, with though things look better in a lot of different ways, and people participate online versus in person. Humanist groups might look different than atheist groups, broadly speaking, things like that. But there are a lot of questions about diversity There are a lot of questions about creating more welcoming environments and getting new people involved. So if you've been engaged in these conversations before, if you've wished that our community was more diverse and more welcoming and was better at getting different kinds of people in and keeping them, people from different backgrounds and different communities, I hope you're also interested in doing the work to help foster a more inclusive community. So let's talk about what that work might look like, at least some of it, because that's a good thing to discuss. But first, I talked about this kind of thing once before, and I realized when I was asked to talk about how to increase diversity in our community, that it raised a question for me that I wanted to ask to the audience. And if we were doing a workshop, I would say, let's take 5 minutes, break into small groups, and come back with your answer. And the question I wanted to ask was, why? Why do you want to see more diversity in your group or in this community? Why do you think it's important to foster more inclusive secular communities? And I'll give you some of the reasons that I think people have offhand. One, it's because it can feel embarrassing. Sometimes we look embarrassing. Sometimes we see pictures of local groups and we're like, is that what we look like? Where's everyone else, right? So honest reason, sometimes we look embarrassing. We want that to be different. Two, because we live in diverse environments and there are people with all kinds of different experiences in our regions. When we have a lack of representation in our social spaces and our groups, it reinforces our ignorance. It can show us that we have certain blind spots, and that diminishes our ability to live our secular values, our humanist values. How can we serve our community well if we don't know what's going on in parts of our community? Third, besides these other considerations, if our communities lack diversity, we probably have some barriers to inclusion up. And that probably means that there are needs in our local communities that secular people have, and we're just not connecting with them. There are people we could be supporting, but we're missing them instead. So we could be doing this better. We could be living our values better. So let's talk more about what we, who are members of the secular community, can do considering these things we know. And also let's talk about some actions that you, the audience members, can take and all of us can take to help make this community more inclusive and better. I'll go through some different ideas and suggestions. This could be a long presentation. It is hopefully not going to be that long of a presentation. This could be a very long discussion, but I wanted to distill things into a few different areas and start with a clarification. The clarification is that there is no magic bullet answer here. For the 21 years I've been involved in this community, from the very first event I went to, I've been asked, how do we get more Black people in our group, to be frank? Or how do we get more young people in our group? Or how do we get more of you people in our group? I'm asked that a lot. I know Mandisa Thomas and Anthony Pinn and Sakivu Hutchinson and others are asked that too. How do we get more of Community X in our group? We have none. We know they live here. How do we get them in our group? And there's not one answer. It involves a lot of change. So instead of saying, here's a list of 7 things to do, and then blammo, different people will appear in your group, we could do that. But if you don't think about structural change and change at a deep level of how you function and how you think about what you're trying to accomplish, they won't stay. It won't stick. So I decided to pull out a kind of different level of thought about how we do our groups and how we foster community. So the first slide, the first point to make is to think about your group's mission, vision, and values. It's like, so you want to have a more secular community. Why? So you want to have more diversity in your group. So you realize that there are people who are missing who should be there. The question why, go through the process of clarifying your vision and your values for your group. Why does your group exist? What are you trying to accomplish? Who do you serve? What does it look like if you're succeeding at your mission? I think you can work towards having a clear idea of what you're trying to do and accomplish. I suggest that be a conversation with your leadership team in your campus group. I also suggest writing things down so you remember for the future. If it's part of your mission to build a more inclusive space, how do you do that? Or is your goal make more atheists? Some groups have that goal. You can do that better if you have more people making more atheists, though, so you still should be concerned about like getting different people in your group still. It's good that when you start having this conversation, or if you decide to schedule some time on your meeting planning schedule and say, let's think, we want to be more diverse, we want to be more inclusive. How do we do that? Let's spend some time thinking it out, writing things down. That's not a one-time conversation. And as campus leaders out there, you know that probably because the turnover rate is so high in leadership, right? You don't have people stay around for 10 years, probably. So it's good to touch base with your leadership team regularly to check in on your mission, vision, and values for your group. And there are a lot of resources online about like checklists and ideas lists for how to talk about mission, vision, values, or determine your mission, vision, values, how to do strategic planning, things like that. But you should check in on that. Once a semester is fine, be like, is this still what we are? Should we change anything? Should we change our focus? Is there something that we're missing? Like, understand why you have a group and what you're trying to accomplish. And also, trust me, that will save you headaches in the future too, because oftentimes we see in group leadership when there are massive disagreements, which sometimes lead to groups dying or splitting, it's because there was a lack of alignment about what the group was for. So I make that a big suggestion. I also wanted to highlight that Alison talked about the fact that in order for American atheists to advance our mission, we need to consider things like who is harmed when religion is tangled up in government. Clearly, the immediate answer isn't always atheists. You know, we might work on an adoption policy because a religious agency is able to use federal funds to block Catholics from adopting. And there are some members who might say, well, that's hurting a Catholic family. Why would you care? We're atheists, you know, only care about issues that affect atheists, without seeing that, no, it hurts atheists. It's religion in government harming people, which is what our mission is, not just those two atheists got hurt, right? So we choose issues, and it's part of the way that we think about how we do our mission, knowing that atheists and others are harmed when government and religion aren't separate. So again, that's a big thing. Also, don't just talk about it. If you're serious about building a more inclusive local or a campus group, you have this conversation with your leadership, you should also be ready to commit to taking the steps to do that. Those next steps might be doing more research. Those next steps might be talking to your membership, bringing them along, posting a survey, you know, Googling things. I would recommend getting group members involved in this process. It probably wouldn't be a massive shift from what your group does, but it might change, say, your online comment moderation policy or something like that. So in my organizing philosophy, I lean more towards always creating opportunities for your members to submit input to feel like they're part of the process. So I'd recommend clarifying your vision and your goals along with them. That's step one. Two, I guess these aren't steps. Another idea is code of conduct. Codes of conduct help you achieve your group's goals. Groups are collections of people for some purpose. It's nice when you can lay out expectations ahead of time and say, hey, we have this group for this reason. We think that certain actions are harmful to achieving those goals, and they are not allowed. So, helps you foster the kind of community you want to have. Since we're talking about inclusive communities, I would say this is very important. Also, an online version for your Facebook group and whatnot. You can't be equally welcome to everyone. If you want to welcome people into your group who are going to be sexist, you will lose women and people who are concerned about sexism. So this goes back to your mission and your vision and your values. You should set out expectations that reflect your group's goals and your values. Please. Again, this will save you headaches in the future. and help you make a better, more inclusive group. That works for local groups, that works for campus groups, and online groups. Another idea, and this is just, again, lifting up something that Alison talked about, is to build partnerships and coalitions. Coalitions are a way to work on issues of interest without thinking that you need to be experts on them or put all of your resources into figuring out how to get engaged in that. An LGBTQ student group on campus is an easy partner for secular campus groups. They be like, give us a heads up the next time you're going to do a thing, we'll be there, or let us know if there are things that we can work with you on, we'll volunteer together, things like that. They're also a way to get more other kinds of people to know about your group. Your goal in working these coalitions is not simply to get more people from group X to join my group, although that can be a happy result, but it can help with representation of your group on campus. It can help open up the door to co-sponsored events, activism opportunities, new potential speakers, community service opportunities, all the good things. And you can learn about them. If you don't have people from group X coming to your group meetings, but you partner with group X, now you can learn more and be more aware of what's relevant to group X. Another idea, be relevant. And that includes in your tangible events and activities, the issues that you do, the topics that you discuss, the events you put on, the function of your group. Your group might be comfortable with what it's doing, but you still have concerns about lack of participation from certain communities. Well, maybe what you do is not relevant to them. Are the community's interests in line with what you offer? If you want to see a different result, you may need to do things differently. And you need to also recognize that if you succeed in bringing in different people, your group will be different. Your group will change. That's something I think that has been an issue in some community groups I'm familiar with where, say it's an older crowd, and then a lot of students and recent students join. The students and recent students may have different issues that are a higher priority to them. And the local group gets very mad because now their group is changing. I've heard that that's been a concern with the national level ethical union, in that they want younger people to join. Younger people say, hey, we like hip hop. Can we add some hip hop to our Sunday platforms? And the old people are not happy about that idea. If you want different people to join your group will need to change too, or the people will leave because it's not jiving with them, it's not relevant to them. Try to be a well-rounded group too by offering different kinds of activities and opportunities for involvement. In Philadelphia 15 years ago, the groups were what we often see stereotyped as largely overwhelmingly white men, until they started doing service activities. They partnered with a food service organization called Philabundance. I think the first event, 72% or 68% of the attendees were women, and they had like 50 people. The leaders of the groups were like, where did they come from? And the women were like, we didn't want to go to philosophy talks. So we were on your list, but we didn't show up to things. But when you offered the service opportunity, we were very excited about doing something for the community. And I'm not saying like women always like service and men like philosophy talks, but different demographics and different groups are interested in different things. You may have a parents group, you may have, a Bible study group for Bible study people. At American Atheists, we highlight the 4 major functions of community groups in our ACES program, ACES, and that stands for activism, community, education, and service. At SSA, the same thing was promoted. It was called CASE. Different order, same letters. But the point is different activities appeal to different people. So if you want to be welcoming to more people and offer things that are interesting to more people, make sure you're offering different kinds of activities, not just philosophy chats, not just online discussion. Do you have service? Do you have social events? These are different things that you could add. Activism opportunities, that will attract different people. Another idea, and this could be a big one, but not to make it big. Recognize that people have different backgrounds, concerns, and needs. That sounds obvious, but it's very difficult for some of us. In my experience, and this is not entirely a complaint, there are people who are most familiar with the online atheist community who think that atheists come from a similar background of growing up in an area surrounded by evangelical Christians. And so they would be very interested in arguing about how Matthew 25:16 says one thing and not the other thing, or whatever it might be. I was like, I grew up in the Northeast with the Catholic Jewish background. Catholics don't read the Bible. I also don't think it's like absolutely true in every way. This stuff just, I'm not interested in plugging into them. They're like, what? But you work at American Atheists. Yeah. And guess what? We don't talk about the Bible at American Atheists much either. A surprise. Sorry. So like different people, you know, ex-Mormons in Utah have some set of interests and needs, and they might want to have an ex-Mormon group. Ex-Muslim, certainly that's the case. Black atheists in different areas might say, like, you know, there are things that we want to talk about with other Black atheists because they'll be understanding and we won't have to explain ourselves. But not only that, you know, in the survey, we're seeing some other interesting data coming out about, again, youth, older people. We're looking into what rural versus urban and suburban, which there's a lot to do there. But I wanted to give one example here that I think is telling, and it'll be probably my last story example. A few years ago, I worked closely with Killian Bowen, who was on the Secular Student Alliance board as well for a few years. Killian was my intern. And Killian ran the SSA group at Morehead State University in Kentucky. I remember them talking about some of the members of their group, like more than two, being kicked out of their homes while they were in college or just before college by their parents because their parents found out that they were queer and or an atheist. And so other members of the group put them up, gave them a couch to stay on, or like had an extra bedroom that they could live on, or basically the family supporting that person, but it was coordinated through this SSA chapter. And I was like, well, damn. My group outside of Philadelphia looked nothing like that. We were basically a philosophy discussion club, you know? That was not a need that we had. So different people have different needs. For some, it might be social support. You know, for young people in some areas of the country, there's a lot more with this kind of the support that Killian and the Morehead State University group was able to provide. You know, Lubbock, Texas doesn't look like New York City. And that should be obvious, but I think we could do a better job of respecting the fact that people in our community come from different backgrounds, have different interests and different needs. I messaged Killian earlier today to see if I could share the story and if I had the details right. And Killian was like, yes, please do. And I quote, "It's definitely very important for mental health to have these groups, crucial even." And from their experience, I think this is absolutely important. I have a couple more I'll mention quickly. And I think that's why I mashed them on one slide. No, I mashed a bunch of things. Recognize that organizing is a skill. This took me a bizarrely long time to figure out because it's not something you study in college. No one shows up at a career day fair like, I'm an organizer. Come to my booth, I'll tell you how it works, right? And so I don't think, particularly for newer people who are getting involved in activism and organizing, that there's a recognition or appreciation for the skill of organizing. And like other skills like management and leadership, you can work to get better at it. There are resources, there are books, there are people who have more experience who can mentor. There are organizations like Secular Student Alliance and American Atheists. And if you would like information on something or you're stuck or you don't know how to move forward on a thing, you can reach out to us and we'll happily have an hour phone call or a Google Hangouts call with you or a leadership team to talk it through with you. Because we have experience and have worked with a lot of different groups and have been able to absorb the wisdom, but recognize that it's something that you can work at and get better at, and that you probably aren't going to start out being good at. We can all improve in different ways, but see yourselves as organizers. And feel free to contact our field teams for assistance. And speaking of that, Another idea is make sure you're connected with national organizations and for the campus leaders out there with community groups. Again, we talked about the fact that there isn't always alignment about the issues that you want to prioritize and the ways that you function. You might want to have drinking events 8 p.m. on a Friday. They might want to have lectures 10 a.m. on a Sunday, things like that. But if you can at least connect with them, have a relationship with them, you're representing your interests. You're educating them. They're educating you too. And they might have some experience and things that will be very helpful to you. Same thing with national organizations. I like to suggest that everyone subscribe to all the lists and find out at least the information and share with your members. You can learn about different opportunities that fit your interests. You can learn about volunteer opportunities and internships, and you can get ideas for different things that your group could do. Also, if you don't like what they're doing and you subscribe to the list, you can always let them know. We see your emails, even if we don't respond. Sometimes there are a lot of them, but you can always be like, hey, this thing you did, here's why you're wrong. They come in. So if you think that they are misguided or could use a push in a good direction, or you have interests like, why aren't you doing climate change? You can always send that email to them. And lastly, if you're serious about this, if you're serious about building a more inclusive and welcoming secular community, both, at your campus, in your region, at the national level, on the internet, be serious about this. If you're thinking of your campus group and your school community, spend time with your leadership team or make a leadership team to go over your mission, your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? What values are guiding you? There might be a discussion about free speech versus something else. I don't know, cancel culture, and how you moderate your Facebook page. Think about what goals you're trying to accomplish and then try to make decisions based on those goals. But also, of course, most of us are volunteers, and we spend a lot of time committed to this. You also need to consider, of course, your personal values. How important is it to you that we build a more inclusive community? How much power do you have to build a more inclusive community? Is it important enough to you to schedule a meeting with your leadership team? Is it important enough to research further or make an action plan and move forward on it? Or is this always just going to be in the wouldn't it be nice category? And so I could do more wrap up, but hey, we wanted to have time for questions. So that's the last note I'll make. Thanks for the time. And now I'll look at the chat box for questions. Allison, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, that's been phenomenal. I don't have anything to add. I just want to point out that our data reports, again, are available at www.secularsurvey.org. And you can see on the screen Debbie and my email address. If you please reach out if you need help with anything or if you have any questions or want to follow up. And we can take some questions, Kevin.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think like Debbie, every time I hear a presentation on the survey, I always learn new things. And so I was like writing down I did write down little facts or little things that I was like, okay, I need to remember that for the future.
Yeah, we actually did. There's a whole presentation on the survey that's actually much more in depth on the actual thing. This was just, I tried to pull out some stuff specifically on this topic, stuff that we haven't actually presented yet. So some of that is from the new briefs that we're going to be creating. So it's exclusive data. Anyway.
No, it's great. Yeah, and so the reports are available, and I did put the link to the survey in the chat so people could easily access that. A couple of questions for Alison, and then we'll sort of pivot back to Debbie. There was Chevy sort of is sort of a comment, and I think there was the over-representation of white males, and that's not as necessarily a problem, but then as a result, then that leads to less or the oppression of women and minorities. And Sevi should have asked is, do you think that women and minorities of all stripes are a little bit more hesitant to identify as non-believers? So afraid of repercussions and suffering consequences and those sorts of things.
Yes, I do. And that they're going to actually show the stats on that in the new reports that we're creating. But We did ask what sort of labels people identify with, and there are certainly differences between those populations. Like less people identify as atheists, they might identify as secular or non-believers. Non-believers, especially popular, for example, among the Black participants, just to give you an example. So I don't have all those stats on me, but yes, we did see differences in how people identify. So, calling yourself an atheist group might pull in certain groups, calling yourself secular might pull in different groups. It does matter. I do think the difference is most people identify to at least some extent as atheists if they are non-religious. So I think, these differences are able to be overcome, especially through outreach and coalition work and community building. But it is important to know how you come off initially, because people have certain assumptions when you hear certain words, right? So anyway, that's to give you an idea.
No, yeah, and there's a lot of interesting things behind that one. And I was to say, for Secular Student Alliance, our own survey work, we've been finding that more women and more people of color are coming into membership and leadership, which, not to say that we are done with our work by any stretch of the imagination, but we're happy to see that things that our chapters are doing and the outreach that we're doing is speaking to a larger population and becoming more representative of the population that we're working with. So we still have a lot to work to do. Our chapters are still doing work, but that's all good things. We had a couple questions for—
One important thing, I want to just note too is, when you look at the youth data, like it's much more, for our survey, it's much more diverse than the full data. So the people that are older. So 18 to 24, we had more people of color, we had more women. It's much more diverse. And I think that's, Debbie talked about some of the reasons why diversity is so important. One of them is if the continued future vitality of our movement, we have a changing demographics in this country, and we need to be able to appeal to people, and we need to, if we want to think about this and propagate our important issues we work on into the future, then we need to sort of appeal to changing society. And so I think those things are also worth considering.
Definitely. We had a couple questions regarding sort of immigrants, and I don't know that, was there any sort of data that sort of immigrants and then parents, people going back to their country of origin?
Sure, that's a great question. And so one of the things you learn about doing a survey is that there are always ways to improve upon doing a survey, right? You can always do better. Afterward, you're like, wow, I really should have done this. And there's always going to be that. It's just inevitable. Well, I really wish we had a question on immigrants, immigration. We did not. So I cannot answer really anything about that, unfortunately, because I think it's really important. But I just can't say anything about it at this stage. But what was your second part of that question?
No, the second part was just talking about children who may be in the U.S. and then go back to their country of origin.
Yeah, it was complicated asking about children too. So we didn't ask about immigration, but also, you had to be at least 18 to take the survey. So we asked parents about their children, but we were not able to ask young people themselves, which creates some difficulty in getting at some of the data. So unfortunately, these are not issues really that we're able to address. If I could do it all over again, we would definitely include them. And that's something we'll keep in mind for the next survey in 5 years or so.
Wonderful. Debbie, Ruth was asking and I think this goes along with the survey results as well, but for the Black or African American community, isn't there really a greater stigma against non-belief and then somewhat of a larger need for being in group with like-minded or like people?
Yes and yes, but actually Alison is working on a relevant report and has better information from the data side. Although I have a lot of information from the experience side. Like the ages were different, right? The Black respondents to the survey were younger.
They were younger. They
tend to be atheists for a shorter length of time, and they definitely experience higher rates of discrimination and even like physical abuse. I forget the term that was.
There were much higher rates of criminalization, like not criminalization, physical like assault because of their atheist identity. There was not much difference in discrimination because of their atheist identity, but like I thought you made a really good point earlier, Debbie, where you talked about how when people experience discrimination, they don't always know why they're just experiencing the discrimination, right? And so, you know, people might not always associate discrimination with being an atheist versus being Black versus being a woman. You know what I mean? It's a little bit hard to disentangle that sometimes. We did find increased levels of stigmatization of different, you know, especially Black participants. And we also found higher levels of concealment, especially among family, for example. So that's a really big deal too. So people tend to conceal their identity more, which also has a lot of mental health implications. Interestingly, though, we also saw that the Black participants were more likely to be part of local groups, which is really great, like a much higher rate than the average participant. I think it was like 26% versus something like 18%. So it's 1.5 times as much. And it also had a really positive benefit for mental health. So being part of that sort of larger community is really impactful.
Great. And Marty was asking a question to Debbie. He says, as a humanist chaplain in the university setting, the SSA group invited religious students to their meetings. And they said the result was not what was expected. Most religious students said after participating that they were glad to be a part of it because their religious group, you know, their thoughts were too controversial or conflicted. And so this was sort of openness and inclusion from the secular students and easier to sort of have those communication and topics.
I just found that question, but I think the last sentence is the opposite.
Okay.
Our group was too controversial. I was just scrolling. So the secular group drove the religious people away into appreciating more the religiousness.
Huh, that's it. Yes. The interesting part is our SSA chapters often have religious members who come regularly to the groups because they like having discussions and conversations that they can't have in their religious group. I do think that some of our students, depending on where they are, do feel like this is a space for non-religious students and we don't want religious students to come because it's our space. And we want this space to be our own as well.
Sounds like an interesting mission. Discussion about, you know, what you're trying to accomplish with your group and therefore like what's the priority, what's the audience that you're trying to reach, who are you serving, right? Like, and there are different layers to how many audiences you might have and how you interact with them. But that's it, yeah. How religious were these religious students, I wonder though? But yeah, if they're coming to I can imagine if you're going to an SSA meeting that a lot of times there is a lot of openness to discussion and making good arguments, right? That's the hope. But it is kind of like a debate club sometimes. They can be, in my experience. And I can see that that's not what, you know, if you go to the Hillel meeting or something, it's not the same. It's a little less kumbaya. But then everyone goes out drinking afterwards. So it's, you know, in that sense, you're all friends. You argue more.
Yeah. Our chapter at Missouri hosts the interfaith panel every year for the entire campus. So some of our chapters have sister religious groups. One at Clarion, the religious group picks its crew. Religious group picks the movie that they watch and they discuss. And the next month, our group picks the movie that they discuss. So there's lots of a variety of I think of what's happening. And some groups, where they are, and as you sort of talked about rural and those things, you know, have that need to be a little, you know, this is a place for us. And the group isn't there. The environment they may be in may be highly more religious and they need that safer community and those sort of things. So we find a lot of it also depending on where the group is and the surrounding circumstances and the level of religious predominance in the community often plays a sort of a pass in that.
Yeah, I think when I was a baby gay, basically, when I started going to LGBT, well, what did we call it at the time? Gay and lesbian meetings in Philadelphia, my first years of college. I was kind of surprised at the vitriol about straight people and some in group derogatory terms about straight people, and I was like, what, straight people made you? Straight, everyone, like, what are you? But it was just, the sort of blessed feeling you get when you can be in an in group and just relax and be like, oh, straights, am I right? That happens, and I can feel like it's violated when you invite others into your space that follows like your rules and has your culture, and they're like, what, this kind of sucks, this is not what I expect. And it's like, yeah, it's not for you. But I can imagine if they had, dinner together or something like that, people would be on different behavior.
I'll sort of do a little last question. There was a little bit about language. So one is, the term secular and using that, and are we talking about, separation of state or just non-religion? And then also sort of, humanist with the term, rather than atheist, with the term humanist be more popular and more positive.
Sure, those are great questions. And we actually do a lot of work looking at different terms people use and what they identify with and what they prefer in the report. So check it out at secularsurvey.org. And we're also going to be looking at each subpopulation report, how people identify, as I mentioned a second ago. So humanist, I think 14%, I believe, of all the full 34,000, that was their primary identity. For atheist, it was about 60%, maybe a little bit more. And, asked who identifies as what. A lot of people identify with multiple labels, but the label that was most common, like people identified mostly or very much as, was atheist. So humanist is a great word. It's great for a lot of people. I think it's after atheists, people identify with that the second most of any of the other labels. It also, a lot of people don't know what it means. So that's also problematic. So it really does depend. I mean, if you're using a label for your group and people don't know what it means, it just means you have to do more education about what it means and, talk about it, which also can be really helpful. Maybe you want to use it to distinguish yourself from different groups as well. So I don't think there's one right answer. You asked about secular. I think it's important to understand that secular has multiple meanings. Sometimes it just means non-religious, right? And sometimes it means, like, we often call ourselves a secular movement, your Secular Student Alliance, that has a different meaning than just non-religious. It means, well, I guess it does mean non-religious, but it means doesn't just mean the opposite of religious. It means non-religious in some ways, if that makes sense. So, that can be a little bit hard to understand sometimes, but a lot of people identified with the term secular or non-religious as well. When I speak on these things, I tend to say atheist or non-religious, just because it covers a lot. And I think people understand it or grasp what it means, but your mileage
also,
vary.
like, contractually obliged to, because we work at American Atheists.
No, but it is.
It is part of our strategy, and this may need to change, but what you're saying is, because the term is stigmatized, shouldn't we use a different term that's not stigmatized, that's not as well known, but hey, it's also not stigmatized, maybe brights. I hear that's on the market still, kind of, right? And so part of American Atheist mission is to destigmatize the term atheist. So yeah, we could say, yeah, we're calling everything humanist now, but then people who are calling themselves atheists are still going to be seen as, baby eating devil worshippers or whatever with no morals. And we want to change that. How do we change that? We get more people. In fact, I had that on my previous version of a list of things of what can you do as an individual? Actually, try to identify as an atheist in more instances. That helps destigmatize the term. Oh, I'm an atheist. I'm not religious. So that's my recommendation. But yeah, it does. If we had more people representing that, we could shift faster how people think about that term. We do that by using it. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to. I've been hesitant to use it sometimes. And when I was applying for apartments in New Jersey with this job at American Atheists, I had to write American Atheist as my employer, and I was kind of like, whoa. I don't know. I really want an apartment though, but is this gonna read weird? And Alison and others were like, no, it's New Jersey, who cares? So
yeah, and I think we use the term secular as an inclusive umbrella because we know that students are identifying in multiple ways. And I think the survey data shows that the majority of students, if a single identifier, choose atheist. but that really, for most younger people, they're using 3 or 4 different identifiers. And we just don't find that in the non-religious community, with the LGBT community, with issues of race. And those are things that the community, the younger people, are just very different in that sort of manner. And I will think one of the things that we tell our students, that when I speak with local groups, they say, if you want new people, you have to do something different. Change is important. And you both have echoed those comments as well. And if you're not willing to change, you're not going to get new people. And that's okay. Like, if you're happy with where you are, okay. But if you say you want new people, that does require change, and it requires your group to put in the work. So yeah, and we can use data to help us make informed decisions and to guide us in some directions, but the really is, you've got to do the work. I want to thank both of you for participating today. I really appreciate it. Personally, I love the both of you. I love working with American Atheists, so thank you very much. I'm going to wrap things up because we have our next session to get ready for. With Liz and Rebecca from FMRF. So thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah.